Under the shroud of night, in the quiet moments where the world's noise fades into the distant hum of existence, there are whispers that pass between realms, whispers carried not on wind, but on the invisible current of eternity. These whispers do not come to all men, for not all men are meant to hear them. Yet on a night that felt woven into the very fabric of prophecy, three men stood in separate corners of the world. Donald Trump in the golden-lit solitude of a private room in Florida, Vladimir Putin in the cold silence of a Kremlin chamber, and Xi Jinping beneath the watchful gaze of the Forbidden City, and all, though far apart, received the same chilling message. It was not delivered through human lips, nor carved into parchment, but pressed directly into their minds as though time itself had reached out and touched them. The warning was simple in form, yet infinite in meaning. The tide is turning, and what you build will not stand unless you yield to what you cannot control. For a fleeting moment each man felt it, like the shadow of something vast passing over them. The sense was unmistakable. This was not politics, not the machinations of nations, but something older, deeper, an authority no throne could rival. The moment was so vivid, so consuming, that even these hardened leaders, accustomed to secrets, power, and games of dominance, paused in its wake. But pauses are fragile things, and the mind, when uncomfortable, is quick to bury what it cannot explain. Trump, in the days that followed, pushed it aside. He told himself it was merely a dream, an odd, perhaps unsettling one, but nothing more. The affairs of his day, the endless calls, the legal battles, the strategizing, were easier to grasp than the phantom weight of prophecy. He had been warned, yes, but his mind told him what power could be greater than the will of a determined man. He thought in terms of influence, deals, victories. Yet the message had not been about victory. It had been about surrender, the kind of surrender that was not political defeat but spiritual humility. And humility, in his world, was a language rarely spoken. Putin received the same message in the cold of a Moscow dawn. The silence of his office was almost a participant in the event. When it struck him, his eyes had gone still, fixed on nothing, in particular, as though searching in the dark waters of his mind for the origin of the voice. For years he had considered himself a student of history, one who understood the rise and fall of empires, the patterns that repeated like ancient rhythms. Yet this was not a pattern he recognized. It did not speak of enemies to be outmaneuvered, or borders to be drawn. It spoke of forces beyond steel, beyond armies, beyond the reach of even the most cunning statecraft. He felt a flicker of unease, the kind a soldier feels when standing on ground he knows is mined. But as with Trump, the daily demands of power and the comfort of one's own strategies drowned the memory of the words. In time, it became nothing, more than a strange echo, easily ignored until it faded into the background hum of his mind. Xi Jinping's experience was different, for when the voice came, it seemed to speak through the very stones of the Forbidden City. He was alone, and yet not alone. The air seemed alive with ancient presences, the kind whispered about in the old dynastic histories, where emperors sometimes received warnings from heaven. China had its long tradition of the mandate of heaven, the belief that rulers reigned only as long as heaven allowed it, and that signs and omens foretold the loss of that mandate. As I understood the symbolism instinctively, but the modern mind, shaped by decades of calculated pragmatism, pressed the experience into a corner labeled mystery, where it could be stored away without consequence. Still, somewhere deep, the old traditions stirred. The message had come, but like the others, he did not bend to it. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and across the world, the invisible threads of history began to tighten. In places far from the halls of power, strange events unfolded. Storms arrived where skies had long been calm. Economies trembled without clear cause, and nations felt the tug of unrest that seemed to have no origin except in the hearts of men. It was as though the warning had not merely been a suggestion, but a declaration, an immutable law set into motion. The three men, separated by ideology, culture, and ambition, were bound together now by the same choice they had made: to ignore. But prophecy is patient. It does not fade simply because it is dismissed. Rather, it circles back, its voice growing louder each time it is unheeded. The second time it came, it was no longer in the quiet. It was woven into events, into the turning of headlines, into moments that caught them off guard. Trump found himself in the middle of a speech when, for a fraction of a second, he lost the thread of his words, not because of distraction, but because in the back of his mind the sentence came again. The tide is turning. Putin heard it in the middle of a negotiation, the voice threading through the words of his counterparts like an invisible current. Xi heard it during a private meeting, where for a moment he was not looking at his advisors but past them, as though something else had entered the room. Still, they resisted. To heed the warning would mean to acknowledge that there was a force above them, not an adversary they could defeat, but an authority they could only bow to. It would mean admitting that the foundations of their power were built on sand when the tide was rising, and men in such positions rarely confess to such vulnerabilities. The seasons shifted, and with them the world moved into a period of great turbulence. Alliances faltered, economies fluctuated like uncertain tides, and the common people across nations began to sense a shift they could not name. It was not simply political unrest. It was something heavier, something like the air before a storm that would not pass quietly. The same phrase that had been whispered into the minds of three leaders now seemed to hum in the collective subconscious of humanity, as though history itself were rehearsing a truth it would soon reveal. Somewhere in the unseen, the one who had given the warning watched. The voice had not been born from human will, nor from any earthly source. It was older than the pyramids, older than the first written word, older even than the mountains that now lay silent under the snow. It had seen empires rise and fall, kings and presidents rise to power and return to dust, and it knew well that ignoring such a warning never ended in silence. It always ended in a collapse that reshaped the very bones of the world. When the third and final time came, it was not a whisper at all. It was an event. The tide truly began to turn, and each leader, in his own way, saw the warning fulfilled before his eyes. By then, it was no longer a matter of choice. What they had been told was already in motion, and no wall, no army, no law could hold it back. It was not an attack from without, but a shaking from within, a kind of unraveling that began in the unseen realm and spilled into the visible, changing everything. And in that moment, perhaps they remembered, if only for a heartbeat, the night when the voice first came to them. Perhaps they realized that power, no matter how vast, is always on loan, and that the tide belongs not to men, but to the one who moves it. But the moment for yielding had passed. The prophecy had not been a request. It had been the telling of what would be. And it came to pass exactly as it had been spoken. The tide did not announce itself with a single great wave, as men often imagine in their myths and warnings, but with subtle shifts, the way a shoreline changes imperceptibly before the sea finally claims it. In the early months, these shifts seemed almost trivial. Small market corrections that were dismissed as cyclical, whispers of dissent in regions long thought under control, fleeting stories buried beneath louder headlines. Yet, beneath those surface ripples was an undertow of staggering force, pulling whole nations into a convergence they could neither see nor stop. Those who could sense it, the prophets, the mystics, the old men who had outlived governments and wars, spoke in riddles and sighs, for they knew that a truth too plain would be rejected, while a truth cloaked in mystery might yet slip past.
The pride of kings. Trump first noticed the change in the tone of the crowds. He was a man who measured strength in the roar of approval, who understood the energy of people as a kind of currency that could be spent and multiplied. But in certain gatherings, he began to sense something different. Not opposition, not apathy, but distraction, as though their eyes were on him, while their minds were on something else. It was not political drift, it was a deeper disconnection, like the slow dimming of a flame that had once burned fiercely. The strange thing was that it mirrored his own occasional moments of detachment, those brief flashes where the warning he had buried would surface, tugging at the edges of his attention like a hand from beneath the water. In Moscow, Putin moved through his days with the precision of a man who trusts his plans more than chance. He had weathered storms before, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, even the pressures of war. And each time he had relied on a blend of patience and strategy to outlast his adversaries. But now, there were signs that did not fit the logic of statecraft. Intelligence reports carried patterns that no analyst could explain, alliances fraying in ways that defied cause and effect. Rival powers making moves that seemed reckless yet oddly synchronized, and domestic pressures that flared without any visible spark. Even his most trusted aides, men who had served him for decades, began to show strain, not fear of an enemy, but the unease of men who sense they are part of a story whose author they do not know. Xi Jinping, ever the tactician, tried to read these changes as shifting variables in the grand equation of global order. He was trained to think in decades, to see history as a long game where patience and consistency yielded control. But China's vast machinery was beginning to make sounds that no engineer could diagnose. There were surges of unrest in unexpected places, sudden collapses in industries long thought unshakable, and, most unsettling of all, rumors among the old scholars and cultural historians that the mandate of heaven might be slipping. Normally, such talk would be dismissed as superstition, but the strange alignment of events made even his rational mind pause. The old texts spoke of signs, the failure of great works, the discord of the people, and the arrival of natural calamities that mirrored the moral decay of the court. Though the forbidden city's walls stood as strong as ever, something unseen was gnawing at the foundation. It was as though the world itself had entered a strange twilight, a liminal space between what was and what was coming. The air in cities seemed heavier, the wind in rural fields carried an edge as if it had traveled from some distant place of unrest. Markets, usually governed by charts and forecasts, began to behave like living things, shifting with moods no economist could track, rising and falling on rumors that dissolved like mist. Crops in certain regions withered despite perfect rainfall, while others flourished in defiance of drought. Migratory animals changed their ancient routes, their instinct seemingly confused, and in some places the night sky glowed with auroras, far beyond their usual borders, as though unseen hands were drawing curtains of light over the earth to signal that the play was about to change scenes. Trump felt it in a subtle but persistent way. The cheers of his rallies still thundered, but there were moments, small, fleeting, when he would look out over the crowd and see eyes that were not locked on him, but on something invisible, as if the people themselves were waiting for a sign, larger than politics. He brushed it off, telling himself that focus could always be reclaimed, but at night, when the noise faded, he would remember that strange dream, the shore, the endless ocean, the tide pulling in with impossible force. He never spoke of it. Not to his advisors, not to his family. What would they think if he admitted that a voice had come to him, one he could not command or debate? Putin, ever the master of reading men, began to notice a different kind of silence in his meetings. His generals and diplomats, skilled in hiding. Weakness now carried an unspoken question in their eyes.
a question they could not articulate because it was not about strategy, but about the strange order of the world itself. He heard of floods destroying infrastructure in allied nations, of mysterious industrial accidents that seemed unrelated but happened in rapid succession, and of small uprisings that began not with ideology, but with a strange conviction in the people that the old ways were ending. Yet the machinery of state demanded forward motion, and so he pressed ahead, keeping his mind on tangible matters. The intangible could wait until it could not. Xi Jinping saw the changes not only in the physical world, but in the intangible pulse of his nation. Economists delivered data that should have brought reassurance. But there was a fragility in their voices, as though the numbers were merely a thin fabric stretched over a growing hole. Reports came from distant provinces of rivers changing course, of ancient trees toppling without wind, of farmers claiming they had heard the earth sigh before the ground shifted under them. His own sleep became restless. Sometimes he would wake with the taste of salt water in his mouth, though he had been nowhere near the sea. The vision of the ocean came to him too, not a raging storm, but a steady, inexorable rising, like a truth that no wall could keep out. And still, they told no one. The warning remained their private shadow, unshared, unspoken. The pride of power has a way of isolating its bearer. Each man imagined himself the sole recipient of this strange omen, and therefore the sole master of its meaning. But in truth, their separation was the prophecy's most precise weapon. For a warning divided is a warning disarmed. The world's stage began to tilt more sharply. Where before there had been only hints, now there were signs that even the untrained eye could see. Nations that had stood together for generations began making sudden, inexplicable decisions. Treaties abandoned, partnerships dissolved with cold swiftness. Wars did not break out in the old manner. Instead, countries turned inward, as though each were bracing for something they could not name. The atmosphere in global summits changed. Speeches grew shorter, handshakes more reluctant, smiles edged with tension. It was not the heat of open conflict, but the chill of an approaching shadow. The natural world answered in kind. Entire coastlines eroded in a single season. Volcanoes long thought dormant spat ash into skies that dimmed midday into twilight. Lightning storms flashed without rain, as if the heavens were warning with light alone. On some nights, the moon itself seemed unnaturally large, hanging low and red over cities whose people watched in uneasy silence before retreating indoors. Old prophecies, ignored for centuries, began circulating again, whispered in marketplaces and posted on obscure corners of the internet. Many dismissed them, but others could not shake the feeling that the earth and sky were conspiring to speak in a language older than any government. It was in this climate that the voice returned, not in articulate phrases this time, but in a deeper, more invasive way. Trump heard it in the hollow pause between sentences during a televised interview, as if the silence itself had leaned forward to remind him of the tide. Putin felt it when he stood before a map of Eurasia, tracing lines of strategy, only to find his hand slowing as an image of waves overtaking the land filled his mind unbidden. Xi felt it during a ceremonial address, where for a moment his words seemed to dissolve, replaced by the sound of water surging against stone. Each man knew instantly that it was the same force that had visited them before. The recognition was not in the mind, but in the soul. A primal certainty that the tide was no longer merely approaching. It was already in motion. And yet, with the stubbornness common to all rulers who believed themselves chosen by destiny, they turned back to their tasks. They convinced themselves that foresight and force could redirect even this unseen current. They did not realize or refuse to admit that the current was not moving through the world. The current was moving through them.